The other thing that it kind of was brought to mind when you were talking about this, Chelsea, is like the reverse can also happen in terms of like a lot of people. I feel like, especially when they go on social media. I know my cousin definitely has experienced that where she's constantly sharing all this bad news that's going on, and it's like this emotional contagion that is going on
Mhm.
social media where it's exacerbating all the anxiety that people are already feeling, and then people are sharing like, I'm doing really really horribly, this is
Mhm.
just really taking a toll on my mental health, my physical health, like I can't get myself out of this hole. And I think a lot of people are also experiencing that, but also by communicating that, that can also lead to emotional contagion where everybody else that's reading that also starts to feel that way as well. I don't know if
Definitely.
you've experienced that.
I've had
Yeah.
to counsel several people, mostly a lot of people who don't quite yet understand that a research psychologist is not the same thing as a counseling and clinical psychologist, so they come to
Right.
me for advice. But the advice that I feel comfortable giving out is to the news once a day. Like once a
Yeah,
day,
limit
sometimes
your news
I
intake.
mean, just in
Mhm.
the morning or at night or whatever, but just like once a day, read the news, get caught up, and then just shut it down. Because if you're feeling yourself getting overwhelmed or in this negative spiral or something, reading the news is not going to help you. It's not helping anybody else either if you're in that negative headspace.
Chelsea and I were just talking about that last week, and we were looking up things that had to do with like natural disasters, and some of the articles that I was reading around 9/11 were that people actually experienced PTSD from watching people fall out of the
Right.
towers and just
Mhm.
seeing that replay over and over and over again on the media. And I almost feel like we're seeing that as well, where it's just like, oh,
Yeah.
somebody else that's really young died of COVID, and you
Mhm.
just kind of feel helpless and,
Yeah.
like, oh man, I'm just waiting for myself to get it or my family members to get it. Like everybody's gonna get it eventually or what have you.
Right.
I'm
Right. You
glad
just
that Miley brought up the just post-traumatic stress in general, because that was what first came to mind when Michelle initially asked the question of like, what is your biggest widespread concern as a professional right now? And to me, it's the potential trauma that people are experiencing and it's different, I think, per person, per situation. And what I mean by trauma is anything that's like anything that feels or any moment that feels overwhelmingly terrifying and that you don't feel like you have the resources to cope with or overcome. And I think we have like triggers of those and waves of those coming at us, these potentially traumatic experiences or visuals on the news or whatever. Like it's coming at us all kinds of different ways. It's even coming at us probably in our house in quarantine with our relationships with others, which I think we're going to talk about, like with Ben here as a relationships researcher. But that's something I've been perpetually concerned about because people are in this heightened, prolonged sense of fear, which is actually why we did the special feature on Inside the Chrysalis with the guided safe place meditation, because there are ways we can try to like turn our fear response, tone it down a little bit, and that can actually prevent us from having long-term consequences like post-traumatic stress symptoms. But I think when we're in survival mode, it's really hard to know sometimes that that's what's happening. And so that's a concern I have personally as a professional. However, on the flip side, I think if we can think about these potentially traumatic experiences or this upheaval we're feeling as kind of just an energy shift, because really trauma is really just this like surge of energy that's coming in our body and our brains, right? If we can find a way to use it and redirect it and express it, I think this actually, there can be some really awesome things that come of this individually and then collectively as a society.
Yes, definitely. I want to come back to a little bit later. I want to come back to possible benefits that we might be able to see from this. Yeah, Ben.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to jump in while we were talking about trauma and kind of acute stress versus kind of just chronic
Mm,
post-traumatic stress that people might be experiencing. And I feel like it's important to kind of point out that with post-traumatic stress, that a lot of people who are exposed to traumatic events, generally the modal response is that most people do better. So I don't think that anybody needs to be feeling these stressful experiences and thinking that they're being doomed to kind of suffer this
That's a great
after effects
point.
and aftershocks for forever. But definitely be aware if that is happening, that there are effective treatments for stress and kind of prolonged stress um, that people might be experiencing.
That is a really great point. I actually was curious. I was going to ask you, do you see, and this may be something you have experience with, it may not, I don't know. Do you see any parallels with like the health in the military that you see? Because if you're dealing with health factors in the military, then post-traumatic stress is a big part of that, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's really where a lot of that research comes from. There's really two populations that people study post-traumatic stress disorder in. One is military exposed to combat, and then the other is in sexual assault cases.
Mhm.
So those are the two groups. They do see similar pieces between the two, where over a period of months and years, generally everybody's acute response goes back to a normal piece as they process it. But a lot of people don't also. So not to minimize that as being any sort of personal failing or anything that's caused by the individual.
Sure, that's a good point, but so it's a note of hope that you don't have to feel like you're doomed, like you said, to this experience. But then also, it is a factor, and if you do find yourself going down that path, there is treatment, there's help available, and there's hope on both sides, I guess. Yeah.
And I also want to note, and I'm thank you, Ben, for adding that, that it can sometimes be delayed. So we don't know what people's response is going to be to the pandemic. Really, I mean, we've had other pandemics in history, but there weren't as many people like us really researching these types of things. However, I'm in Houston where we had Hurricane Harvey a few years ago, and so I dug into the research on natural disasters at the time, and I noticed that I think it was Hurricane Andrew, there's quite a few samples of people that went through Hurricane Andrew in the 90s who didn't show post-traumatic stress symptoms right away or just after the hurricane, but they were started to appear 3 months later. And I wish I could remember the specific ones for people to look out for, but who knows in this context? We really don't. But my point is that just because when we do start going back to normal and the media or whoever else tells us that, oh, it's over, or whatever that means, like for you, just keep in mind that like your feelings still matter and that it might not, even when people aren't talking about mental health crisis anymore, like you might still be in one, or you might find yourself in one later, and that's still valid, even if it's after the pandemic.
Sure. And I mean, it might be triggered by an outbreak because, we've had
Sure.
outbreaks of diseases before and viruses, and we might have another one that turns out not to be a global pandemic. But as soon as we hear the word outbreak, we might, have this
Right.
kind of triggered response.